Hey guys, welcome back here to Intuitive Angling, and appreciate you guys coming by the channel for the video today. And there's a couple different things I want to talk about today. One is how to trigger a strike from an inactive bass, and the second one is how to trigger a reaction strike, which is one of the things that triggers a strike from an inactive bass. I want to get into specifically what causes bass to bite a lure, and it's going to surprise you what that is. A lot of people think this because they're hungry. That's not what it is. So we're going to dig into that in today's episode, and I think it's going to help you guys have a really sort of a new way to approach fishing that's going to help you guys out. Also, guys, before we get started, one thing I want to remind you of, speaking of like forcing a fish into bite and tricking them into bite, check out this new Megabass karashi twitch bait. This is called a twitch bait, guys. It's a slow sinking bait, but you can fish it like right on the surface, like a topwater. And the way that I like to fish it is it works really good for like schooling bass or clear water. You can throw it out there and you can just like jerk it across like a jerk bait across the surface, and it just darts like a little minnow trying to escape away. It's about the same size as a minnow. It looks like a real fish in the water. So I'll put this Megabass karashi in my tackle warehouse link in this video description if you'd like to pick one up. But it's a great bait for any time that you've got schooling fish or bass that are chasing herring or shad, especially if you have water visibility over 3 feet. This Megabass karashi will definitely catch them. So I really appreciate you guys checking that out there. Again, tackle warehouse link in the description of the video. Okay guys, let's dig into this. How to get these inactive bass to bite, how to trigger an inactive bass to bite, and specifically how to create a reaction strike in bass. Now, we've talked about this some before in the past, but it's a really good example as far as understanding bass movement behavior a little bit. When you talk about what causes a bass to bite a lure, one of the foundational things I talk about a lot here on the channel is that bass rarely bite because they're hungry or they're actively feeding, unless you're fishing at night. I mean, I think pretty much throughout the whole course of the season, all year long, even in wintertime, I think most of the bass are night feeders. I think they feed nocturnally. I think that they feel safer. They can get shallower. They can get more active. They just aren't near as timid in low light situations. And I think they feed very heavily at night. Now, don't get me wrong, because bass is an opportunistic feeder, and if they think they can get a meal safely, they're going to do it. But as far as when you have bass out actively hunting for food, like any other predator, I think that most of that feeding goes on at night for sure. So that's one of the basic foundations you have to realize before you approach your fishing. So given that, since we've laid this foundation that most bass feed at night and they don't actively feed during the daytime, is you have to figure out how to catch a fish during the daytime of the year by catching them when they're in a non-feeding mode. And it all centers around tricking a bass into bite. And that's what we're trying to do, guys. We're trying to trick a bass into hitting an artificial lure that they are timid to bite for the most part at any time. And that's why you have so many different lure categories out there, is an attempt to trick those bass into biting based upon their mood and their personality. Sometimes you have to trick them in to biting a bait that looks realistic. Like if you're fishing a green pumpkin Cinco with no weight on it and you're just crawling along the bottom, it looks like a real worm. That's like a visual attractant. And if you're throwing like a rattle trap or something like that, that's buzzing through the water 100 miles an hour and does not look like anything real, you're trying to trigger a reaction strike from that fish. And then every other lure category sort of falls in between that, between attracting that bass from a visual look and a reaction strike. So the elements that are involved in there are like instincts, reaction, competition, curiosity, all that type of stuff. It's very seldom actively feeding. It's just like when you are crawling that plastic worm on the bottom. They're swimming down there and they look at that, and it's like they can't really make up their mind if it's real or not. They're curious about it, and a lot of times they'll pick it up and they may suck it into their mouth and they may spit it out or whatever, but they're a lot of times just not actively feeding. So therefore, how do you trigger a bass? How do you trick a bass into biting that doesn't want to bite, specifically through a reaction? Okay, now a lot of it has to do with a lot of different factors. One of the primary things that you can do to trigger a reaction strike is through your speed of retrieve. Speed of retrieve, based upon your water temperature and water clarity, can sometimes trigger a bass into biting. And normally, the reaction strike is triggered through a little bit faster retrieve because it gives them, they don't have an opportunity to think about it. Let's say, for example, you're fishing a square bill crankbait next to a lay down log and you're using a fast retrieve, like a fast stop and go retrieve. When that square bill is like buzzing by that log like that fast, they don't have time to like, okay, should I hit it? Shouldn't I hit it? Shouldn't I hit it? It's like you're taking advantage of that instinct, that primordial instinct that a bass has. It's like, okay, there's something right in front of me. I better dart out right now and get it, or I'm going to miss out on a meal, or I'm going to miss out on something. They may not be hungry, but it's just it's an evolutionary instinct for them to always want to eat when they can, or take advantage of getting food when they can, even though they may not be hungry. And that's how you create a reaction strike. A lot of times it's through speed or retrieve. Now, the speed or retrieve can be a lot of different things based upon the lure category, because the speed or retrieve on a square bill crankbait may be completely different than like the cadence or the speed or retrieve on a jerkbait. For example, let's talk about another lure category being the jerkbait. Sometimes, they want a bait like a jerkbait, jerk, jerk, pause, jerk, jerk, pause. Sometimes they want it jerk, jerk, pause, and let it pause for a long time, twitch. Sometimes they want it jerk super hard, sometimes in between. So based upon the mood and the personality and the water temperature and the water clarity at that given time will dictate the type of retrieve that's going to generate a reaction strike. And this is one of the things that makes it a little bit more difficult, because you don't create a reaction strike just by reeling a lure fast. It can be a combination of pulling, twitching, half turn, pause, steady retrieve, medium retrieve, fast retrieve, slow retrieve. You have to figure out exactly the retrieve the bass wants. The next thing that you have to do to trick a bass or to generate a reaction strike, it's a combination of not only that retrieve, but the right lure color and lure profile. A lot of times lure color makes all the difference in the world based upon the conditions you have, based upon your light intensity conditions, your water temperature, your water clarity, your wind speed, your wind direction. All that stuff incorporated together can sometimes make some lure colors generate reaction strikes that others won't. Sometimes that reaction strike is generated by a natural translucent looking color. Sometimes it's by a bright gaudy color like a chartreuse or a white. Again, it just depends on the mood and the personality of that fish, but that is one variable that will trick a fish, is lure color. In correlation with your lure profile, sometimes a smaller profile lure, sometimes a bigger profile lure, sometimes a finesse jig, sometimes a full-size jig. All that stuff works in correlation to figure out how to trick that bass into biting. And then finally, it has to do with your casting presentation and your casting angle. The angle that your bait comes by an object, now I don't care if it's a drop off in 20 foot of water or if it's a stump in 2 foot of water, a lot of times the angle that bait comes by that piece of object will determine if you're going to fool or trick that bass into biting. And those variables can be how that bass is positioned on that piece of cover based upon the current, based upon the shade or the sun or the wind or the water temperature. Could be a lot of different variables with it, but all that stuff mixes together. If it sounds complicated and if it sounds a little bit complex, it is, guys. That's why bass fishing is tough on public lakes, because you have to hit upon those variables. And the more of those variables that you actually hit upon, the more bass you're going to catch. The variables we just listed there, let's say you got a dozen different variables that create a reaction strike. If you hit on just 2 or 3 of those variables, you may catch a few fish here and now and then. But if you hit upon 8 or 10 of those variables, you may catch a bunch of fish. So try to think of it in that terms. So when you're bass fishing, guys, unless you're night fishing, always think in the terms that the bass are not actively feeding, they're not hungry. You have to fool them and you have to trick them into biting, usually through one of the other, strike inducers that I just mentioned there. So anyway, I hope it helps out, guys. We'll talk later.